de volta para o segundo painel deste segundo dia do quinto Fórum Anual do Ondjango Feminista, o FAOFEM 20, onde estamos a debater o tema central Mulheres em resistências por economias justas. Neste painel, agora, vamos falar sobre privatizações e outras reestruturações, implicações para as mulheres, e será moderado pela Áurea Mozinho, que é membro da coordenação do Ondjango Feminista, é economista e apaixonada pelas questões de economia e entende que as questões de economia são questões do feminismo e que é importante falar sobre isso. A Áurea tem mestrado em Economia e Desenvolvimento pela Universidade de Soas, na Inglaterra, e vai ter como convidada a Crystal Simeone, que é do Quênia. A Crystal vai falar em inglês e por isso queria pedir que clicassem, quando ela estivesse a falar, clicassem aqui no globo, na interpretação, e pusessem em português para ouvirem a tradução daquilo que a Crystal vai dizer. Sem mais delongas, vou passar a palavra à Áurea para a moderação deste painel. Áurea?
Obrigada, Cisa. Obrigada, Crystal. Obrigada a todas as manas que estão aqui a nos assistir hoje. Eu tenho ideia que são quase 20 horas e, para terem ideia, são quase 23 horas para a nossa convidada, a Crystal. Ela está 2 horas à frente, no Quênia. Então, eu queria começar por agradecê-la por estar aqui tão tarde para falar de um tema que geralmente tendemos a ver como muito aborrecido, mas espero que não. E acho que a nossa paixão, tanto minha como da Crystal, é desmistificar os assuntos econômicos, é trazer a economia, que é um assunto de vida, como nós aprendemos ontem, para ser uma questão muito importante de discussão entre as mulheres, para as mulheres, porque nos afeta, diz respeito a nós. E por que privatizações? Por que falar de privatizações? No contexto angolano, principalmente. Desde 2017, o país tem vindo a sofrer grandes reestruturações econômicas no âmbito da crise econômica e financeira que tivemos a sofrer, mas também como resposta a um novo paradigma de relações internacionais que está a se construir. Nessas relações, nesses programas de reestruturação econômica, vamos falar o que reestruturação significa já daqui a bocado com a Crystal. O pacote de privatizações, o programa de privatizações chamado PROPRIV, aparece como um dos principais instrumentos do governo para atingir vários objetivos, dentre eles estabilizar a economia. I think, Crystal, you can't hear me, right?
I can't hear Rita very well.
Oh.
Now you're better. Now you're louder. You were very faint before.
Ok, tá bom. Bom, o PROPRIV, que é o Programa de Privatizações do Governo Angolano, surge como um programa a longo prazo, 4 anos, que entende privatizar exatamente 195 empresas nos vários ramos da economia. Setor extrativo, setor financeiro, setor produtivo, alguns serviços como saúde, e é apresentado como uma das soluções para trazer rendimento ao governo, mas também para sairmos dessa crise econômica. Mas nada, como tudo na vida, existem suas contestações. A literatura, quando se fala em privatizações, é muito crítica dos efeitos das privatizações, principalmente dos serviços públicos, naquilo que são os direitos das mulheres. E nós gostaríamos de abrir essa conversa hoje, porque num contexto de pandemia, num contexto de precariedade econômica, num contexto de vulnerabilidade, nós gostaríamos de, enquanto Ondjango, tomar uma dianteira em questionar o papel dessa suposta recuperação através de privatizações para... eu estou aqui a olhar para a Crystal, que parece estar a ter dificuldades em ouvir. Crystal, you can't hear, right?
Rita's voice keeps fading in and out. Maybe it's your microphone, Rita.
So
Yeah, like your voice is waving in and out.
Okay, so Crystal, what I'm going to do, I'm going to speak to you in English. Let me just speak to you in English. You can switch off your translation, and then people can still hear us in Portuguese, okay?
Okay.
Okay.
That works.
So I was explaining why we're talking about privatizations to start with, but I didn't introduce you yet.
Okay. Yeah, I got that far, and I'm glad I don't have a poker face, so you can see exactly what I'm thinking.
So, who are you, Crystal? To me, you are this amazing feminist that cares as deeply as I do about macroeconomics. And we need to explain to people why do we care about this.
Yeah.
But you know, very recently you started doing work for NAWI, this African Feminist Macroeconomic Initiative that cares about influencing public policy at national, regional, and the global level to ensure that women's rights are respected and upheld at these different levels with respect to the economy. Okay, I'm gonna try to speak a bit slower and I'll ask you to do the same. So let's start from the beginning. Why is it that as feminists, as women's rights activists, we need to talk about macroeconomy first? And why should we care about privatizations at all?
Okay. That's a loaded question, and I tend to sometimes speak fast, so just wave at me and I'll slow down. Like you said, my name is Crystal. I am based in Nairobi. I recently am part of a new initiative called the NAWI AfriFem Macroeconomics Collective, and its work is making sure that we're influencing policy spaces, and especially macroeconomic policy spaces, which I'll explain in a bit, from a very Pan-African feminist analysis. Pan-African because we're all fighting for women's rights globally. You know, the war is the same, but the battles, the little battles, are very, very different in terms of manifestation, depending on whichever region we come from, because of our history, because of what's happening as a result of our histories and our current context. The nuance is very, very different. And so the things that we fight for from an African perspective can be very different from an Asian perspective or a Latin American perspective. So that's the first thing. My career centered around inequalities largely, and the more I worked in this space, the more I felt influencing macroeconomic policy was important because of a number of reasons. Usually when we speak about economy and women or economy and women's rights, there's a sort of tendency to focus on the micro and individual. And so the narrative of poverty reduction, which incomes, you know, livelihood projects, 50 chicken projects, or beadwork projects, these little micro interventions that have never really taken any women, I'm speaking fast, slowly, which have never really taken any women out of their current status. And so the move to begin to influence policies at not just individual level, but at systemic levels that have a greater impact in terms of the quality of life as a whole. What hospitals I have access to, what schools we have access to, what sort of water we have access to. And it really begins to speak to a social contract between state and citizen. Our social contract between state and citizen is basically we pay our taxes, we're accrued certain rights. Access to universal healthcare, for example, and universal healthcare should be enshrined in most of our constitutions that say, as a citizen of X country, Angola or Kenya or Namibia, I should be able to access quality, accessible, affordable, most times it should be free healthcare, for example. And so that's what the social contract speaks to. I will move back a bit to say, this is why we focus on macro. And so macro policy is really basically about how fairly our countries are able to collect taxes and revenue through things like taxes, who they collect it from. So are women paying a higher share of taxes through value added tax, for example, when you buy your sugar, when you buy your tea, when you buy whatever we buy at the supermarket or fuel your car, we're all paying of consumable tax which is a value-added tax. And so that talks about how fairly income is or revenue is collected. Are we paying taxes on menstrual pads, for example? When helicopters, for example, in Kenya are tax exempt. And so it begins to speak to the priorities of a country. But on top of that, it also speaks to how we spend the money. So it's a fair collection of revenue, but an equitable distribution of the same revenue. And what do we spend money on? Are we spending money on mega infrastructure and bridges that only a few of us are able to use because there's a toll put to it? Are we spending money on maternal hospitals, which will make sure that our mothers are able to deliver safely in quality, dignifying facilities? It speaks to what our countries prioritize. And so incomes, and now I'm going to speak to why privatization is so important.
No, just give me a second. I think you mentioned 2 points that are really important repeating.
Sure.
On why talking about macroeconomics. So the conversation on women and economy, as you put, we can influence at certain level when we talk about microcredits, when we talk about agricultural tools, when we talk about fertilizers, when we talk about, to some extent, even the informal sector, right? The preceding panel was talking about informality. It seems like these are spaces where women are allowed to voice their concerns about the economy. But in the big and important and macro decisions about how the government, how the country gets and spends the money, we're not allowed to navigate into this territory. It said, no, it's not a women's rights issue. Yeah. When, as you say, it influences all of these other policies, all of these other decisions. So that's why we care about the macro level, right?
Correct. And it also speaks to representation. Why do we have the IMF or the World Bank at conversations that are deciding how much money is spent on a maternal health care unit in my country at a very local level? At a very minimum, as a citizen of this country, I should be able to be at that decision-making table to influence whether I need specialized theater equipment at my village level, or do I need a facility that's properly equipped to the very bare minimum, right? So it's also about agency and representation and voice, and who gets to sit at these tables of decision-making, which, they say very local problems have very global solutions, right? And we need to be able to influence decision-making right down from our households, but all the way up to global policy-making spaces like the United Nations, like the World Bank, like the IMF. Some have called a global governance space a very apartheid space where African countries specifically are not privy to. But if you add on top of that African women, we're not anywhere on that list. And so we're completely invisibilized. And so it's time to take back the power, but take back power according to our own narrative. There's a women's rights narrative beginning to influence these spaces, but a lot of the time, the voices that speak are not ours. We are relegated to case studies, but the analysis is not by us. The stories are about us, but we are not sitting at those tables. And so it's about time that we begin to change this narrative and actually sit and speak for ourselves. Don't speak for us, just pass the mic and we can speak for ourselves. Okay. So it makes, exactly, you sort of summed it up really well.
Let's have our cake about privatizations then. Why should we care about, in the greater scheme of all possible macroeconomic policies, why talk about privatizations and right now?
Yeah. So I'll take us back a little bit, and I'm sure we've all heard of the Sustainable Development Goals, a set of agendas that we are, as a world, as a globe, is supposed to contribute towards achieving by the year 2030. Now, in 2015, the world came together at what they called the Financing for Development meeting in Addis Ababa, which was really to talk about, which was really to talk about financing the Sustainable Development Goals, which at that point, and I think still now, have a funding gap of $1.4 trillion a year. And so the basic narrative was there isn't enough development funding to plug this gap. So where do we get this money from? And we were basically given two options. The first was domestic resource mobilization, and this is through taxation. At the back of your mind, always remember that we have a fight for tax justice to be able to collect our revenue, especially from big multinationals. Currently, the continent of Africa loses $100 billion every year through illicit financial flows. And this is basically big international, multinational companies setting up shop a lot of the time in the extractive industry and finding ways to find loopholes in our legislation and our policies to shift profit away from the continent and shift it to low tax havens. So basically, they're operating in our countries, but not paying their fair share of taxes in our countries. Now, when you break it down in terms of illicit financial flows, only 5% of that is through corruption. 65% of that is through commercial activities being the multinationals that are operating mines, that are operating big international companies on our continents, and basically taking the money and making sure that we're not able to tax them as much as we should be able to. So nobody's saying don't pay your taxes, just pay your fair share of taxes, which would then go into developing our continent. We get about half of that, about $15 billion in terms of developmental assistance. So very basic math. If we didn't have these leaks from taxation, we would be able to cover our own development. So the world told us we have domestic resource mobilization through taxation to raise revenue, and the other alternative was through private finance. And through this narrative...
Okay. So let me summarize and ask you to speak a bit slowly.
Sure.
I know it's hard, Crystal. I know it's really, really hard.
It's also because I'm passionate, so I'm like...
Yes. So you said that the beginning of this conversation is that we, if macroeconomics is about how we get our money and how we spend it, we're looking at how we get this money, right? To finance all of our developmental needs. And this is housing, education, health, and so on and so on, social security, and so on and so forth. And this money comes from somewhere because, of course, African countries, a lot of our countries are not able to get all of these money internally from our own taxes, so they turn to the international sphere to get development assistance. And this is sorry, am I speaking too fast? I don't know if I can speak a bit slower than this, but let's see. I'm getting a lot of prompts to speak.
No.
Slowly. Even me, I'm getting. Okay, let's try again.
Yeah.
So yes, I'm gonna not see the chat because otherwise we're never gonna finish this conversation. Okay, I'll try to speak slowly. So there's a funding gap in this sense. So we don't have enough money to sustain our needs, and therefore we're seeking different ways of getting development financing. And one of these ways that you were saying was
through taxation, domestic resource mobilization.
Okay.
But remembering that we're not able to collect as much through taxation because multinational companies that set up shop on our continent have found ways, loopholes, and gaps in our legislation and in our policy to be able to shift profit away from our continent. And so we're not able to claim our taxing rights and remember their rights of whatever they're doing. So they'll come and set up shop, a gold mining company in Congo. They will report very high costs of operations, which then means that their profits are very low. But really what it is shifting things around on paper so it doesn't seem as if they're profitable, but they're moving the money out of the continent. And through this, we're losing at a very minimal amount, very conservatively, $100 billion.
I can't even think about how big this number is. So
exactly.
We're losing as a continent $100 billion every year.
Every year, and we're getting. I'll juxtapose that against the amount that we're getting in development assistance, which is about half of that. It's 50.1 billion. So if you do the basic math, if we weren't losing the taxes, we would be able to cover our own developmental targets.
Okay.
But because we're bleeding through, they call it illicit financial flows through gaps and loopholes in our taxing systems, in our revenue, legislation, we're losing this money, and so we're not able to retain what is supposed to be ours.
Não é possível ficarmos com o que é nosso.
Oh, sorry, I think we got, okay. Go on, Crystal.
Okay. And so nobody's saying not pay, not to make any profits. All the tax justice movement is saying is pay your fair share of tax. And is everything okay?
Yeah. I think someone's audio, o áudio de alguém está ligado para além de nós. Okay, let's go, Crystal.
Yeah, and so why this is important is because we're constantly told a narrative about how corrupt...
Isso é importante porque nós... A minha voz está a sair.
Desculpem, só a Sizaltina está a traduzir, mas não está na sala. Ou a Jennifer está a traduzir, mas não está na sala. Podemos falar, já está na sala.
Será que você tentar agora?
Não, Jennifer, ainda conseguimos te ouvir.
Mas eu não mexi em nada.
Is everything
Jennifer?
okay, Aurea?
So the translator was shifted to the main room for some reason. Jennifer, ainda estás aí? No, I think it's fine now. Let's try. Okay.
Okay, there's a question, but we can come back to that.
Yeah,
so
let's come back.
basically, why this is important is because constantly we are always given this narrative that our African leaders are corrupt, and that's why we're not able to develop. It's true, they are corrupt, but if you look at the bigger picture and you step back a bit, only 5% of that 100 billion is as a result of corruption. 65% of it is through commercial activity. It's the multinationals finding loopholes in our systems and bleeding our taxes out. So remember that when we're talking about how at the Financing for Development conference in 2015, they gave us domestic resource mobilization as an option, and the second one was through private finance.
Yeah.
And so this is now the big thing. So there's a couple of issues and questions that we need to constantly remember when we think about private finance. And this, we have to remember our past. And Bon Jovi sang a song, "The more things change, the more they stay the same," right? And it's exactly what our history is. And if we remember, in the 80s and early 90s, we went through a series of liberalization, which was called the structural adjustment programs, really spearheaded by the IMF and the World Bank, that basically told us, listen, you're not able to pay your debts. We need to restructure your economies. You need to tighten your belts, no spending on public services or, on public wage bills, but you need to tighten it so you can be able to pay your debts. Thomas Sankara is famously known for making a speech at the African Union at about this time. And he said, well, if we as African countries try and pay our debts, for sure our people will die. We'll not be able to feed them. We'll not be able to treat them in hospitals. We will die. If we don't pay them back, however, nobody dies, because the US Treasury had all of a sudden put the interest rates up. And so our countries really fell into debt. And his logic was, if we don't pay it back, we've already paid quite an amount of money on the capital. Nobody really dies, right? No surprise that a couple of months after this speech, he died, because he was calling for debt resistance. And so this fight has been there for many years, right? And so this neo-colonial, neo-capitalist way of running or influencing our governments continues to be the same. And so during the 80s and the 90s, we liberalized. We privatized a lot of our parastatals, a lot of our government institutions, a lot of our sectors fell apart in Kenya. Our whole textile industry was on its knees and has now completely died. We no longer make any textiles. We no longer make our own clothes. We import a lot of the clothes we all wear are secondhand clothes. You can barely afford new clothes. And that's the state of things that we're in. Agriculture has been highly commercialized. Healthcare has been largely commercialized. And so it begins to tell a story of a narrative that a younger generation have began to believe, that public services and goods are not efficient enough. This narrative that private is better, private is always more efficient, is better, and you must always work harder to be able to pay for private healthcare in private hospitals, pay for private schools, pay for private water, pay for private security, because the state is incapable of providing these things for you. And so the narrative begins to etch away the role of our governments and the role of our states. And that's very important to remember, because it's citizens that are able to demand and to push. But if they don't think that government services and goods are good enough, and everybody's trying to earn some more money to be able to pay for the next best thing, then it begins to, create an imbalance in the way things are run. In the global north, nobody thinks about innovating around putting a light switch on. You put a light switch on, you open a tap of water and the tap runs. You're able to take your children to school. You are able to access a quality hospital and without going bankrupt. The African middle class is one disease away in our families of bankrupting our families. Suddenly you're, fundraising to take somebody to hospital and all of that. And so that was through the 90s. Go.
I think it's really crucial that that you point that this belief in the role of the state is not something that happens now, that emerges historically. Because I was born in the 90s, and you were born in the late 80s. I can't remember a period of my life where we thought that the state was enough, that was efficient. But this has a history, right? As you say, it's not just a history of corruption, it's also a history of how our states were made to be inefficient by certain programs that hindered them from actually being able to provide for their citizens. And the reason I say this is important, Crystal, and I think the story changes from country to country, right? So let's look. For example, in Angola, we're coming out of independence in 1975. But then we went into a civil war straight after, a civil war that never ended from 1961. So it's a continuous period, even though we didn't have these programs of adjustment, economic adjustment, like countries like Kenya and Ghana had. We had a period where our state wasn't working for us, right? So it never worked for us because it was never given the opportunity to work for us. It's not but this now has become, the state doesn't work. And we walk into the 2000s with this idea, right? The state doesn't work. So that's where we were off.
Yeah, somebody tells me to speak slowly. I'm really going to try. And so that was what they called the Washington Consensus, this liberalization, privatization of a lot of our government sectors, of parastatals, of services, of goods, because we needed to constrict ourselves to be able to pay our debts and to be able to run our economies. So we were told. Fast forward to current present day globe, world economy, governance. And we enter now what a number of people led by economists like Daniela Gabor are calling the Wall Street consensus. And this is really private finance taking center stage in the development and the running of a lot of our things. And remember, the 2015 Financing for Development meeting said that private finance was one of our two options in terms of plugging a gap of financing our developmental targets. And so enter private finance. And the World Bank, because the World Bank has such great influence on our governments, in fact, many a time it's very hard to see where our governments begin and where the World Bank ends, because our policies are so greatly influenced by external forces like the IMF and the World Bank. And so they have what they call a maximizing finance for development framework. And what this is basically they say, well, country X, let's look at Angola. Are you having problems providing healthcare for your citizens? Yes. Okay. Remember what we said during the FFD meeting? It's through domestic resource mobilization. How's that going? Not very well. You're losing so much in terms of taxes. You're not able to plug in the gap. So we suggest strongly to use private finance. And we can negotiate that. We can help you negotiate for this. However, to be as attractive as possible to private finance, and so this is private money, you need to change some of your policies and legislation to allow for private investors to come into your country, because you have to remember that Africa is so risky and it's very hard to put money into your country. So you need to make it a bit friendlier for private investors. So all these policy and legislation that might be a bit scary for global north or private sector big companies, you need to change them. Okay. And once you've done that, because again, Africa is such a risky continent. You've got wars going on. You've got, oh my God, hurricanes. Lord knows what happens on this continent. The government needs to de-risk this investment. And by de-risking, it means you have to put a guarantee. So if you're building a private hospital, they will say that you need to guarantee X number of patients that will come into the hospital so that the government services this contract. If this hospital doesn't get to that number, the government has to pay through our taxes a supplementary amount to be able to meet what trajectory of profits this company imagined they would get. If there's political strife, something happens, many of our countries will have post-election violence, some sort of, Nigeria, what happened in Nigeria this year, what happened in Kenya every election, then your government must pay for the loss of business to this company. So they need to guarantee that this company will make its money come rain, come shine, whether you're killing each other, whether there's a hurricane, whatever may come, this company needs to make the money. And you need to promise that, because you're already so expensive and so risky as a continent. You need to be as attractive as possible. But what that means is that they are, in essence, really auctioning off our future income through taxation or whatever amounts that we're able to make into making sure that these private contracts are paid for. And so I'll give you an example. 5 years ago in Kenya, our government entered a leasing agreement with 5 private companies, from General Electric, Philips, an Indian company, a Chinese company, and an Italian company. And the contract was to supply specialized health equipment, so very specialized equipment for theaters, for ICUs, to at least 2 hospitals in 46 of our counties. Now, the hospitals that this equipment was going to it was on loan. So our government entered a loan contract in which they had to pay a certain amount, negotiated by the World Bank with these 5 companies. And we pay every month. Now, the equipment went to the hospitals. Over 80% of that equipment 5 years later has never been used. Why? Because there isn't any running water in these hospitals. There isn't 3-phase electricity, and so the equipment can't run. But also, there aren't any doctors or specialists who know how to operate these machines, and so they're lying in boxes in the hospitals, continue to be not used. We've been paying for this out of our taxpayers' money for 5 years. Questions around who decides what priorities does our country invest in? And so if maternal health care is not profitable, it's off the table. There seems to be interest in mega infrastructure projects, mega highways, and mega train, rails. But the question around who does it impact or who does it help, considering that Kenya built an SGR, a rail that's costing us 7% in terms of debt of our GDP, 7% for one project that doesn't service the internal areas of Kenya. And so it will not service market women who have to access markets or have to access goods. yet we're paying for it out of our tax money. The same women who can't access it will have to pay for it through the taxes that they're spending and paying for when they buy sugar, when they buy tea leaves, when they buy salt, anything that they spend, they will have to spend money to be able to pay back the debt that we've taken. And so questions around prioritization of our state and who gets to decide what projects get invested in and how much money are we investing, what are the pros and cons of this investment is crucial. But also secondly, for all the public-private partnerships and these private contracts that we enter into, because they're seen as private business contracts, they don't go through a public participation process. They hardly ever go through our parliament. And because they don't go through our parliament, we have no access to the contracts themselves. We don't know what's in these contracts, how much have we decided to spend on, how long are we going to be paying, who are the parties privy to this, how does it impact any of our citizens? We have no idea. And these contracts continue to be secret and have no transparency around them. And remember, against a backdrop of poor legislation with regards to taxation, these very same multinationals that are bleeding our continent dry by finding loopholes in our tax systems are then invited to provide public services and goods for our citizens. But on top of that, over and above that, because the end point of private facilities and private companies is profit.
Yeah.
And so what does that mean in terms of upholding a social contract that says the state must provide certain services and goods to its citizens? How do you honor that when there's a private company trying to make as much profit as they can? It's not a favor they're doing us, it's business. And so that means there's an imposition of user fees, which means a lot of people aren't able to afford it, which means there's absolutely no access to quality services, whether it's education or healthcare or transport even. And I think COVID has really exacerbated and really shown why this is important. And we've seen countries like Spain having to re-nationalize private hospitals because in the state of pandemic, you can't have private hospitals. Healthcare must be public if you're able to control it. And so that just begins to give you an idea of what we need to be thinking about when you hear all these public-private partnerships and the privatization of so many of our government services and goods, and the questions around agency, around privatization, and definitely about access.
Yeah. Whew, Crystal, I'll then ask you for us to give us, not now, after the questions, how do we start getting some hope in change? But I like how you made the point out, you made this important connection about how the argument is made to attract business. And in fact, in Angola, I don't know about in Kenya, but here in Angola, the agenda of promoting private investment is like a big electoral agenda, is number one priority in government. But we don't talk about at what cost we are promoting these policies. And we don't talk about this in relation, for example, to national enterprises, or we talk very little about national enterprises. For example, we have fiscal holiday packages that companies come and they spend 10, 20 years not paying taxes. They come and they mine, for example, or they extract oil, they pollute. This year alone, we've had at least three leaks. That's what you call oil leaks.
Yeah.
And then they don't pay taxes. But then the policies, the macro policies are made to favor the private sector. And then
foreign private sector.
Yes. And citizens are asked to be patient. And then and I also asked how you talked about, on the other hand, how privatization just curtails access. So if something is not profitable, it's off the table. And women's rights are not profitable. Reproductive health is not profitable. Security for women is not profitable. Guaranteeing women have safe water, they're not walking 10, 20 kilometers to go fetch water, and wood is not profitable. So all of these is at stake when we talk about privatization of public services. I think these are important reminders. But let me go to see if there are any questions or any hands.
Yeah, and while you're talking about the questions, I think it's important to remember the absolute madness with which the world is run. And so I'll give you an example. The Central Bank of the UK, the governor of the central bank, made an announcement 2 or 3 years ago to say that public-private partnerships don't work for the UK. It doesn't work because their citizens can't access hospitals in a universal way. They can't access education or whatever services. The same government, through their development arm, DFID, which is now no longer there, but through DFID, said that public-private partnerships was a strategy, in the way that they do their development work. And so it begins to speak of very unfair, imbalanced policies, and what's good for us isn't good enough for you. It really paints a really crazy picture, if you ask me.
I really need to go to questions. So
Sure.
Isabel, Isabel.
Sim. Olá, boa noite. Olá, Áurea. Olá, Crystal. Nós temos aqui alguém no público, alguém que está a ouvir com a mão levantada, Juliana António, que queria fazer uma pergunta. Eu queria passar já para ela.
Tá bem, Isabel, pode ser. So we open the mic for someone, Crystal. I'll translate what she says to you in case.
Ela tem o microfone fechado, se puderem abrir para ela. Se calhar, enquanto ela não consegue, eu vou fazer algumas perguntas que estão aqui no chat. Tenho uma pergunta da Winnie Pereira e ela pergunta, se calhar a pergunta já é feita em inglês, mas se calhar eu faço em português e depois tu traduzes, que é para todos perceberem. Por que é que continuamos a deixar que essas empresas atuem ou estejam no nosso continente dessa forma? Por que é que nós deixamos vir apenas por um determinado período de tempo para que os nossos cidadãos tenham alguma formação e depois elas saem, né? Depois elas vão-se embora? Não é possível fazer isso? A pergunta é essa. E depois tem uma outra, da Ana Nunda, que pergunta que sugestões podem nos apresentar para que a situação de África possa sair do quadro atual.
Ok. Deixa eu só pegar essas duas, então. Crystal, there's a question from Winnie.
I can see it in the question box, and she wrote in English, so I think I'm fine to answer it. Do you want me to answer now, or do you want to take a few?
Let's take a few.
Okay.
Let's take a few. So Isabel read another question that says, what can we do so the situation changes? But there's also 2 other questions. Isabel, posso ler essas perguntas estão aqui em inglês para facilitar? Acho que estão ok, yeah? Isabel? Ok, vou ler em inglês então. So pureza, which means purity, she says, Angola is privatizing many enterprises and they are reducing the workforce, where women are always in greater number in the public sector. Mm-hmm. And they're the first ones to be fired without no justification or prior notice. What can we do to avoid, women being fired en masse with all of these privatizations? As I mentioned to you, Crystal, we are scheduled to have 195 public enterprises or enterprises owned by other public institutions privatized in the next 4 years, including our oil company, biggest oil company, including our national airline, our telecom service, if I'm not mistaken, I'll check our electricity service. So a lot of structural enterprises are going to be privatized. Kasia asks, Angola makes deals with the World Bank. In the last years, over 50% is to pay debt. We are trying to open for private investments and privatizations. How can we prevent that and prevent that and also safeguard us against the negative impacts? Yeah, I think those are a handful of questions, right?
Yeah, wow. Yeah, so why we continue to let these companies set up shop, that's something I have no idea. I mean, okay, I'll put it this way. The global south, so Africa, Asia, and Latin America, produce or contribute to the global economy over 60% of global labor and over 60% of raw materials. We only accrue less than 5% of global wealth. And so,
can you repeat that?
The global south, and I don't have the
statistics. It's not your audio is not good. I just want you to repeat,
okay,
so it's in our minds.
Yeah, so the global south, and I don't have the exact statistic in my head for Africa specifically, but the global south, so Asia, Latin America, and Africa, contribute over 60% of global labor and over 60% of global raw materials. We accrue less than 5% of global wealth. And this, as crazy as that sounds, it makes you begin to question things. If somebody's coming to look for copper, you're going to go to Zambia. You're not going to find copper anywhere else in the world. You're going to go to Zambia. If the Zambian government is able to say, listen, these are our terms, you pay this amount of tax or you get out, there's nowhere else that they could go. They take advantage of what technical people call the race to the bottom. Is all our countries trying to be as attractive as possible to provide as low, taxation and as high incentive for the private companies to come in and trying to outdo the next country. What that means is that we're accruing almost nothing for our people for the promise of jobs. But if you look at the quality of jobs, and the devil is always in the details. If you look at the quality of jobs, it's always the lowest level job band. It will be cleaners, it will be the lowest level workers. The more intellectual jobs, the higher up you go, our African citizens do not have access to those jobs. And so the questions around these promises for jobs, we must always question what kind of jobs are we talking about and what kind of pay are we talking about. Kenya produces flowers to the global flower market. If flowers were produced at a minimum wage of the Netherlands, they would be unaffordable in Europe. And so it's an unequal exchange of goods and services. We're exporting our water, our lakes are running dry because we're watering these flowers that are using an almost free labor of our people to send flowers that are affordable to the global north, but yet come at such a high cost to our own people. And so questions around why we allow these companies to come in is a very political one, and one that our technocrats, our politicians specifically, must be asked. But we're always kept busy running around the 50 chicken projects, remember? The beadwork projects, all these microfinance and financial inclusion conversations, and the conversations about corruption. But remember, corruption is only 5% of the amount of money that leaves our continent. The bigger money that's being stolen from us leaves without anyone batting an eyelid. The African Tax Administrators Forum has been doing some amazing work in creating legislation and model frameworks for our tax revenue bodies in each of our countries. However, global taxation frameworks are set by the OECD. The OECD is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. African countries are not privy to the OECD, and so we have no say or input into global decision-making around what tax legislation and policy frameworks look like. However, we're supposed to implement these very same frameworks, which are really extractive of our resources and of our finances. What can we do to change the situation? Somebody asked, and I think it's beginning to break this down. Macroeconomics can have technical elements, just like the HIV movement. HIV is a very scientific health issue, but the movement managed to politicize it in a way that broke it down into a question of power and access, right? And it's the same with regard to macroeconomic issues. There are technical elements, but really at the end of the day, it's a question about power. Who gets a say about how our money is spent and where it's collected from, not just at a national level, not just at a regional level, but as we've seen, definitely at a global level. And if we don't have a say in that, we always get the raw end of the stick. Dereje Alemayu, who's been at the forefront of the tax justice movement, says, if you're not at the table, you're definitely on the menu. And for so many generations, Africa has constantly been on the menu of global power. And so macroeconomics, where the big money is especially that space, and especially for African women who carry so much of our continent on our backs. We need to be at those tables because we're definitely on so many menus. There was a question about especially women losing their jobs.
Through privatizations, yeah.
Through privatization. And this will happen. The African Union has begun conversations about the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. Now, anytime you hear the term free trade, just remember it's colonial and there's some red flags that should be coming up, because a free trade agreement will do a number of things. Remove tariffs and barriers to make trade between countries easy. But what it means is that the very same barriers and tariffs have been put in place to protect local industry and local labor rights, for example. And so what happens when you take away those barriers and you take away those protections? It means that private sector can come in and do whatever they want and pay whatever they want. Ethiopia has no minimum wage. And what does that mean for women working in factories in Addis and in Ethiopia? For factories that are setting up shop, from H&M to Zara to all those factories that are setting up shop in Ethiopia. But no, they're doing that because there is no minimum wage, right? It sounds attractive to them, but who is it for? And the question around, if the economy isn't working for its people, who is it working for, right? The debt question, again, in Kenya, we're at about 70% of debt to our GDP ratio.
We
it's
are
bad.
over 100%.
There you go. We're all in so much trouble. However, I think we can't talk about debt in a silo. I think we have to remember our history and the narrative that we're continuously told, how the Industrial Revolution in the West set them up for success, and we're just corrupt and we just can't get our stuff together and we're just not able to do things. Remember that the slave trade was a contribution and an injection of free labor that fueled the Industrial Revolution. It was, if you calculated at a minimum wage of the American minimum wage, it was an injection of over $60 trillion into their economy for free. The slaves that worked the land grew cotton and grew sugar cane to really fuel the Industrial Revolution, cotton for trade, and sugar for their calories. And so the questions around the system of neoliberalism and the system of capitalism must always have something to subsidize it. Somebody's labor. A lot of the time it's women's labor. A lot of the time it's Black women's labor. But a lot of the time it's continents like ours that subsidize a global economy and make it possible to have so many billionaires in the West, where the first African billionaire is like 147 Dangote. So in as much as we practice this capitalism, the system is set up for us never to be included in the upper echelons of it. But we don't question that. And I think those needs to be questioned as we question the question of debt. And question the unequal exchange of products, of raw material, of labor, of women's labor specifically. And so I find that it's very closely linked to the question around women losing their jobs, but at the same time our countries are perpetually in debt, and we must question to what end. When we first got independence, a lot of our African countries, and Angola might have a very different history, but policies that were very people-centered in terms of economic policy making were vibrant. But those leaders, am I still on here?
Yes, Crystal, I'm just
Okay.
switching on my charger. Yes.
Okay. But those policies were decimated, and came rise to very neoliberal, very capitalist, very violent states that were held up by very external global forces, and continue to still hold the system up and still extract so much from us. So I think the conversation about what debt is, when we're talking about austerity, and narratives matter when we're talking about austerity. In the UK, there was a health budget to cut, which you can call austerity. In some of our countries, we barely had a health budget to cut. So can we really call it austerity? Are we saying and meaning the same things when we use the same words? Definitely not. And so that goes to a lot of the work.
Let me stop you there and explain
Sure.
what austerity is. I'll give you a chance to explain what austerity is.
You can explain while I have a sip of water. I've been talking so much.
Okay. So when we talk about austerity, we're talking about economic policy, since we're talking about the space of economic policies that are that propose cuts in public expenditure. So how much the state will spend on health, on education, on housing, on social services. So for example, we can track this through the national budgets and a lot of other policies. In Angola, we have seen in the last years, for example, a lot of cuts in the, not necessarily in the amount, but in the percentage that the government allocates to certain public social sectors. So what Crystal is asking is, you look to a country like, let's say the UK, that spends over, I don't know, 6% of their gross domestic product in health, you can talk about austerity. But in countries like ours, where we are already spending the bare minimum, that is not even according to what we have agreed as African countries at the various conferences. For example, for education, I think it's 10%, if I'm not mistaken. For health, it's another
15.
percent, 15. For education, 15, right?
For healthcare, it's 15.
For healthcare, it's 15. So we're not even spending close to what we have agreed, to what is put together in our, for example, the African Women's Charter, which is an annex to the Africa's People's Charter as well. So when we're not even spending the bare minimum, can we talk about austerity? And I want to make links here, Crystal, to what has been said in other panels, because I think it's really important to see this picture for us full circle. And in a previous panel, I think it was Florita, she says, you know, in Angola, we have learned to live in a perpetual state of emergency. And it might be one of the other, might have been Irina as well. So I think it's important to talk about this in relation to macroeconomics, because the framework we have, the kind of policies that we have, you know, we always living in a state of emergency. They're not policies for us to thrive. They say they want our economies to improve, but at what expense? And here it's important what you say, and I want to stress that if the economy isn't working for the people, who is it working for? Because what is being said about the reforms, privatizations, for example, the introduction of VAT, is the fact that, you know, we are making a sacrifice. We, the people, need to learn how to live within our means so that one day things may improve for all of us. But the economy wasn't working for us before. It's not working for us now. But like in any other place of the world, private corporations, I'm not talking about small business, I'm talking about multinational corporations, they are still making profits, hefty profits, because their extraction hasn't stopped. They haven't stopped drilling. They haven't stopped, you know, taking the money out. So I think it's important to bring this into consideration. And your last point was about how capitalism and the system always needs to exploit someone. And yesterday we had a panel about the body and the economy. So while these conversations might seem unrelated, you know, they are all very related, because the economy that is defined at the table of who by the decisions of how you put it very well, Crystal. You say this decisions about who how we get and how we spend our money also defines how we can navigate our daily lives, how our rights are materialized or not, if we can live life, and even decisions about violence, in domestic violence. So I think it's important to make those points.
Who's paying for safe houses?
Yeah. Because we have such little time, I want to give you an opportunity to talk about NAWI, your collective, and how a woman organizing to challenge this domain of, this adverse policies, and how we also occupying space at the tables where these decisions are being made. I wouldn't like to live in a this conversation always pains me, but it also drives me. So what drives you to continue advocating? The theme of this forum is women resisting for just economies.
Yeah.
So we talked about resisting in the informal sector. We talk about everyday resistance through our body. Now I want to talk about how are we resisting privatizations in different space. How have women organized? What are the rallying calls that they have put forward? What are the agendas that can be embraced at this crucial time? Over.
Yeah, so the NAWI Collective, so I'll give you a little bit of a history of the name NAWI, because a lot of people think it's an acronym, and I've spoken to Ori about this. A lot of people are like, is it the New African Women Initiative? Like, trying to find what it means. NAWI is the name of the last known survivor of the Dahomey Amazonians, who were in present-day Benin, and they were the world's first recorded all-women fighting force, and they fought an anti-colonial struggle, and they fought against the French. And so the last known survivor of the Dahomey, her name was NAWI. And so it's a feminist ode in terms of memorialization to remember the names of women in our history, because our histories have a tendency of invisibilizing women, especially African women. But it's also an ode to the struggle that they fought against colonialism. And that's exactly what we're fighting. Colonialism in today's world doesn't mean that sometimes they're here with us, but they extract in very insidious other ways at the same time. I'm going to read out a quote by Jessica Horn, which I've read out so many times. She's going to be like, you need to start paying me for this. But I think it's
yesterday.
Yeah, but it's so great. And she says, there is no greater pleasure than creating in collaboration with sisters who hold the vision of our liberation so delicately but persistently in their hearts. I am of the collective of community. There is no me without a we. And so for the movement forward, I think it's important to work in collective. We can't get ourselves out of this mess in silos. We have to make sure that we're speaking to each other. It begins with sessions like this to make sure that people get angry enough to begin to question things, question your local parliamentarian, question your president, question the African Union, question the World Bank, question what these contracts are that your government is entering in with the World Bank and the IMF. The Kenyan Constitution, for example, is very, very heavily embedded in public participation. Nothing should happen from budgets to policies to legislation without a public participation process. We need to engage that process, and I'm sure it's the same for very many other countries, Angola included, and beginning to question macroeconomic policies and begin to see them as real life issues and not just some abstract, overly technical issue.
Yes,
macroeconomic policy.
That again.
I don't even remember what I said. Yeah, I think macroeconomic policies make the difference between whether I can have a baby in a safe environment and I can afford to have a baby, that my child can go to a school that is providing quality education and I'm not having to have a double tax on that education, that as a woman I can walk safely, because all the policies that we fight for, unless they're resourced, they remain but dreamy policies on pieces of paper. When you're talking about violence against women, who's funding safe houses? And do you think that safe houses in the global north are always funded by NGOs? No, there's a government budget line for that. school feeding programs for children in marginalized communities. Who is feeding those children? And must we always have a begging bowl out, or must we just collect our fair share of tax from, multinational mining companies that are in our countries? When they say they're having CSR projects and they're going to build a classroom, we can build our own classrooms. Just pay your fair share of taxation and we'll be able to do it ourselves. And so really, I don't know how to say, but really taking ownership of macroeconomic policies and not being too scared of it, because it is really an everyday experience. It's from the moment I wake up, am I able to switch on my light and get hot water in my shower or not? Am I able to drive safely to work or not? Am I able to afford fuel? Am I able to get into a public vehicle and be safe as a woman? Can I walk in the night? Is there a childcare facility at a market if I'm a market woman, for example, and is the state providing for? Can I afford to have a baby because I know that education is affordable, childcare is affordable, somebody is going to take care of, the old and the sick? Am I able to have time to rest? And who is making sure that there's payment, there's resourcing around that in itself? And so it is a political issue.
Sector.
Definitely not the private sector.
Can you talk about
grind culture?
No, but corruption and inefficiency in the private sector, because there's the idea that the private sector is the holy grail of management. So to give you an idea, for example, the public document that talks about the privatization says we are privatizing, and one of the key reasons is to promote economic stability, to increase productivity in the economy, and then to enable a more equitable distribution of national wealth. And then there's, in other documents I've also seen, because to increase efficiency in the management of these corporations. Can you talk about the fallacy of that? And I'll let you respond to that. And I know there's two other questions that we also get to.
Yeah, and it goes back to the comment that I made. If the economy is not working for the people, who is it working for? Private sector is meant to be profitable. It's not meant to provide services to people. It's not meant to make sure that a population is healthy, that is well fed, that is housed, that is safe, that is educated. That's not the premise of private sector. The premise of private sector, at the heart of it, is money and profit. And so up against policymaking that should have people at the heart of it, that should have citizens and the most marginalized and the most needy citizens at the, at the very heart of decision making, those two can't happen at the same time. How is a system efficient when, people can't access because of cost a hospital or a school? And so the question about what efficiency means, and this is something that I'm also very interested, you talked about, being driven and passionate, and these things wake me up in the morning, but also keep me up late at night, like tonight. It's what is it for, and efficient for what purpose if it's not to provide happy lives for its citizens? And at the basic level, it's for citizens to be living happy, dignified lives that have access to the basics. If you want to go off and up beyond that, that's up to you, but you should be able to access the very basics that can accrue a life of happiness and dignity. At the very heart of it, it doesn't need to get complicated. And that's a role of a government. We do not hire private sector companies to run our countries. We have governments whose job it is to provide for these services and uphold a social contract. Nowhere does a private sector company talk about social contracts at all. And I think we need to go back to the heart of that as an issue for all our movements, really.
Okay. Crystal, there's two more questions. Three. Fantastic. This means that people are actually there. Yeah. I was scared at this time talking about such a issue that threatens so many. So the first one is in English. You can see it. So how do we go about changing these discourses in our African societies? I think you talked a lot about this. Many people are only used to the discourse of corruption and not all of these points you mentioned. How do we engage in these conversations about the effects of this policy and their roots in colonialism and how it harms us? A very good question.
Yeah.
A smaller question from Mathilde. about what can the feminist movement do in response. So you mentioned that as well. And then I'll translate on the go this question from Anef. The current nationalizations in government, as they say, the future privatizations that are also concerning, and we need to reflect about them. It's complex, but these businesses belong to Angolans who benefited from the so-called primitive accumulation from the old presidency, during the old presidency. Now they're shifting hands, and they're going to new hands. So it's unlikely they go to the hands of other Angolans. I think the argument is the services will be pauperized. That's the word that she uses. She says it's most probable that these corporations will not be acquired by Angolans or will be acquired by foreigners. Lebanese, Chinese, Israelis, that they already dominate the Angolan market. In what way does this fragilize us as Angolan citizens? Did you get the gist of the question?
I think so.
So I think the question is, we need to reflect about these privatizations. They're shifting hands. They're going from, people that benefited from the old administration, but they're not actually shifting into the hands of, Angolans. They're probably going to be acquired by foreigners that already dominate the market. And if we're being honest, they dominate the region.
Yeah.
So how does that fragilize us as Angolan citizens? So I'll let you answer those, and also tie in your final considerations. You can be long in your considerations.
Yeah. So I think how we change the discourse. I'm passionate about narratives. I've been thinking about narratives a lot. And I've been thinking about movements and having movements of movements at the same time. I think COVID has shown us that we can't go back to normal because normal was the problem. It's opening up the deep, dark, ugly underbelly of this system that has ruled the world economy for so long, and there's gaps. Suddenly governments are talking about home-based care, which is really care work, if you ask me. They still do not speak about who's going to pay for it and how they're going to remunerate for it, but they're now actually speaking these words. And I think that's progress. I was reading a book by Gita Sen of Dawn from 1985. And to be quite honest, it could be written this year. And so I think sometimes, the older generation of feminists must be so bored with like the same exact issue over and over and over again. And here comes Aurea and Crystal, very excited and passionate about this, thinking that, we're going to change things. But, we rely on the knowledge and work of feminists that have gone before us for so many years, and the knowledge is there. But I think we need to also begin to have a very clear ask in terms of decolonizing knowledge. Who is writing about our issues, and in what format are they writing about? What data are we collecting, and must our lives always be relegated to numbers? Or do we have room for qualitative research and narratives and stories? Because our lives happen in narrative and they don't happen in numbers, really. Oral literature, for example, must all literature be scientifically written down for it to be scientific and knowledgeable? Our ways of telling wisdom has always been through oral ways of passing on information, not very much like webinars. But who's telling our story, and how can we tell our story in ways that make sense to us and decolonize how our stories are told? There was a workshop around privatization of public services. Great idea. If you looked at the number of resources and the authors of these resource pieces, they were all global north, writing about case studies about us. We need to be writing our own stories and telling our own histories and our own stories in that way. And I think that begins to change a narrative. Unless we do that, we will always be playing catch up and reacting rather than, influencing and making changes in what's happening globally. And so that's linked to what I think the feminist movement can do. I think the feminist movement has a bit of a ways to go, especially on the continent, in connecting issues. Aurea knows very well the world around macroeconomic policy for many feminist or women's rights organizations is a bit like, we're not too sure this is our thing. It's a bit too technical. It's a bit too complex. But it's really, like we said, it's about power. And I think there needs to be more of connecting struggles because, as they say, all oppression is linked and we can't just focus on one thing. But all our lives are guided and impacted upon by all these policies, especially macroeconomic policies. It makes a difference between, you know, accessing birth control pills. Who's going to pay for that, right? And this needs to be at the center of our argument. The question by Anef on how, you know, resources move from a very small 1% sort of in Angola, and instead of, you know, being democratized, what's happening is that they're now being passed on to the hands of largely foreign-owned companies and individuals. And I think this goes back to what we were talking about. When you hear public-private partnerships, it's never, the private is never local or indigenous companies. It will always be a multinational. It will always have an extractive angle to it and an extractive global agenda linked to it if you really open it up. And I think those are things that we need to question. It's exactly that. And that's what we mean by we can no longer not be in the conversation of macroeconomic policy because our future is being auctioned off. Everything that we own will be auctioned off and we'll be left with nothing. We're almost left with nothing, actually. Sometimes very hard to find hope, but I think it's there because there's people like us that continue to be in the trenches and to fight and to speak continuously about these things in halls of power. It's making sure that we're in the African Union meetings when they're trying to auction us off, or making questions around the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. As you know, the African Union celebrates it as a win. Africa will be the largest free trading bloc in the world. But what does that mean and who is it serving apart from the 1% even of our own richest people? What does it mean for cross-border traders, for example? And how does it help their lives? We need to be asking those questions. The devil is always in the details. Yeah, I think there's hope in that there is a Pan-African movement. There's a very strong Pan-African economic justice movement. I think we must penetrate those spaces. There's what a lot of people call the African governance boys. That group of men needs to be democratized and broken down, and we need to be in those spaces. They will be speaking to progressive economic policies and trying to influence alongside that, but without a feminist analysis that centers power at the center and at the heart of that analysis, it will not serve all of us. And so I think what I've used is not every time there's a mainstream conference or whatever around tax, around debt, around trade, it's not having just one trade and gender or trade and women's rights side event. It's making sure that there's a feminist analysis through everything. Some will call it mainstreaming, whatever you call it, but we need to like break apart all these different spaces and not just be relegated to, oh, we had a women's session and now we can talk about the real issues. I think that's a very easy way to begin to work on it. I think having conversations like this, sharing ideas, questioning, I think, and reading, but most importantly, contributing to a body of knowledge that is truly African and that is truly ours and that truly represents our story and our narrative. And unless we begin to, or continue, not even begin, but continue to do this, we don't really see change because we constantly have other people speaking on our behalf. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Crystal, what do I say? Thank you, right? But because we have a couple more minutes, I wanted to ask you, it was there when you came here, was there something that was in your heart that you felt that you wanted to speak to, but you didn't? This is the moment, maybe one or two things about the issue, about the space, yeah.
I'm really just encouraged that like on a Saturday evening, there was at a point where there was like 81 participants. Like that's the most hopeful thing I've had this year, to be honest, out of all the webinars. I think it's so not just comforting, but really encouraging that so many people are interested, that there's so many great questions, and I don't have the answers to all of them, but I think we can find the answers together. I am so saddened by how colonial languages have torn us apart. I mean, we're not translating between Swahili and Bemba, whatever, but it's between two colonial languages, and that really breaks my heart, and really also further fragmenticize. I don't even know. I can't find the word. Breaks us down further. I'm so tired. Breaks us down further, and not being able to, I don't know, come together and like push for change, like really together, without having a middle person trying to rapidly translate when Ori is speaking too fast or Crystal is speaking too fast. So that really saddens me and reminds me of, you know, how our history and our colonial history is still so very present with us, in so many ways and so many insidious ways. Yeah, and I really hope this inspired somebody, anyone, as many people as possible to take interest, question things, tweet your government and ask, well, you know, can we have a copy of this contract that you're entering, just to see what this thing is about, and not be scared with the big words. And I think, you know, even just being self-reflective, I think some of our civil society organizations have played a key role in gatekeeping conversations, using big words and jargon, when it's really about life and really about access to services and goods. And that really must be broken down. But I hope we contribute more, we're speaking out more in whichever way that we can. And I'm really looking forward to engaging on this platform again. I really love all of you guys. It's so, I've never engaged with anything Angola specific. So this has been such an honor and such a pleasure to spend a Saturday evening with you.
It's been my honor, my pleasure, Crystal. I know it's very, very late your side. I hope you have a glass of wine because you deserve it for all your, I know more than anything, it's appreciating the solidarity and appreciating the availability to have these difficult conversations, because they are difficult conversations, all right? And they're not difficult for nothing. They're difficult because they are made to exclude us.
Yeah.
They are made for us to not have interest. They are made for us to not question. They are made for us to, you know, keep touching just the small issues, the low-hanging fruits.
Yeah.
So for me, and when we talk about women resisting for just economies, there's not us resisting for just economies if we're not resisting to build those tables, as you said, where decisions about how our governments get and spend money are made. And I think the most of all things that you said, and you said many things important, you said, you know, macroeconomics is about power. And as feminists, we are all about reivindicating, building up, challenging power. And we can't decide which sides we're going to challenge power and which sides we are not.
Yeah.
So if macroeconomics is about power, we need to be there. And I'm very glad, Crystal, to make this journey with you, that you borrowed your time, your energy, your English to be here.
Oh, now I need to learn some Portuguese.
we'll make sure next time you say some words in Portuguese. But I think we felt you across the translation. You know, it's a political struggle to have translation, and
yeah.
This year has been horrible. But we've also discovered that a lot of things are possible. And I'm very honored to have this space with you. And I want to thank everyone that stayed this late to talk about these issues. So you are the biggest winners. You are the biggest people that our appreciation goes out to. I don't want to take long. But yeah, the future is feminist. The future is also about questioning decisions that are made for us. Yeah, so thank you, Crystal. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And I'll pass the word to Sylvia, who's going to end the panel for us. The date.
Obrigada, Áurea. Uma vez mais também obrigada, Crystal, por estas lições, por toda a partilha aqui, muito, muito interessante. Como foi dito, parecia ser um tema que as pessoas não podiam participar ativamente, mas já conseguimos verificar que as pessoas de facto estavam interessadas e partilharam também muitos ensinamentos, muitos conhecimentos aqui através do nosso chat e do nosso QIA. Então, resta-nos uma vez mais agradecer a presença de todas neste segundo dia do FAOFEM, onde discutimos sobre pandemia e informalidade, efeitos e respostas, e também acabamos agora de falar sobre privatizações, reestruturações e as implicações para as mulheres. Foi deixado aqui no chat, peço que as manas da área técnica anotem o contacto da Crystal para que possam seguir os seus trabalhos, é de facto muito interessante. A Crystal tem 10 anos de experiência, mais de 10 anos de experiência nesta área, então sim, vamos partilhar os contactos e as manas poderão acompanhar o seu trabalho. Para amanhã nós vamos seguir, último dia do FAOFEM, teremos mais 2 painéis. O primeiro painel vai ser sobre alternativas feministas para a economia e o último painel, reflexões à volta da pauta feminista, que vamos abrir, vamos dar espaço para que as manas possam participar, deixar as suas contribuições, não é só porque é que podemos fazer daqui para frente, como é que podemos então forjar uma pauta feminista para a justiça econômica em Angola. Lembrar também que amanhã vai acontecer uma marcha a partir das 9 horas, não é? Para repudiar o alto nível de violência pelas quais as mulheres têm sido submetidas. Então, amanhã, a partir das 9 horas, também, todas as manas que puderem participar, seria muito bom. Para mais detalhes, podem visitar a página do Ondjango, onde eu fiz questão de partilhar este evento, que é de facto interessante e bastante necessário. Então, amanhã vamos voltar às 18 horas, o link é o mesmo que estão a usar nestes 2 dias, então esperamos contar convosco amanhã, a partir das 18 horas, pontualmente. Um super obrigada a todas que participaram, as nossas preletoras. Tivemos a Indira Félix no primeiro painel, também tivemos a nossa companheira Florita Telo, numa moderação da Sara Cambinga, e agora fechamos com a Crystal, que foi moderada, a sua apresentação foi moderada pela Áurea Mouzinho. Muito obrigada a todas uma vez mais. A língua aqui não foi uma barreira, não foi um fator limitante, conseguimos, todas as formas, levar até si a melhor interpretação possível, e pelos comentários, pelas questões, conseguimos notar que de facto foi um trabalho bem feito e valeu a pena. Então, uma vez mais, super obrigada a todas, e amanhã nós voltaremos para o 3º dia do Fórum Anual do Ondjango Feminista. Boa noite a todas.